where I was kind of like, man, I would have loved to be one of his partners there in the moment, because I can promise and guarantee it wouldn't have played out completely the way that it did. Um, but I mean, in that same instance, you have the thought of, man, there's really people that just don't care about black people, or people of color. Um, they don't see you as equal. They don't see you as intelligent. They don't see you as being anywhere close to their level. I mean, and that officer has to be one of those people, because I don't really see any other way that he could have been looking at George Floyd in any other way but lesser than him. Um, so yeah, with those things having played out, that just really like sparked the already thoughts that I've already had, and the drive as far as like law enforcement and whatnot, to where I was like, man, if I have the opportunity to have any type of conversations, I hope that I can provide like some really good thought out and 360 perspective input that is effective in a
Absolutely.
forward and positive manner.
Yeah. So you just like a little backstory. DM approached me way back towards one of the first, I think it was city council meetings where they start talking about police reform and the diversity committee, and he's been like at my shoulder ever since. Like, when are we going to chat? When are we going to chat? So,
Yeah.
so I'm excited to hear your perspective on this, my man. Let's go ahead and let's have Justice. Why don't you tell us just a little bit of your thoughts once you started to see things unfold this summer?
So when I first seen like the first little news segment on George Floyd, my first reaction was, okay, I would say it was similar to, a few years back when we first heard about Mike Brown. I had the same kind of gut wrenching reaction, like, are you guys kidding? It's happening again. It's only been a few years, and it seems like every year there's more and more going on. Then, after kind of getting through that initial digestion of those emotions, my second response is I'm seeing these protests kick off, and I'm seeing the destruction that's happening in some areas. So my first thought is, okay, I want to see firsthand perspective. So I got right on Snapchat World Maps, zoom into Minneapolis, and I start looking at all the videos and all the pictures that all the people are posting, and start getting a real idea of, okay, what's going on there right now. And then there's another part of me that is, that former law enforcement professional side, where I'm like, okay, I have to see this body cam footage, because I know how sometimes things can be taken out of context. And as soon as I seen the body cam footage, it all kind of settled and hit at once. And what I realized in that moment was, as far as we thought we had come from the past civil rights movements, the fight that our parents and grandparents picked up before us, we still have so much further that we still have to get to even hope to be called equals one day.
Absolutely. That's such a deep thought. That's such a deep thought, Justice. I was actually just writing it down as you were saying that, like, for as far as we had come. Um, and I think that's such a true statement. And I want to touch on that more later, like what would further look like for us. But I'd like to hear from Barry real quick if we have a chance.
Wow. Gosh, I'm privileged. That's just the reality of things. But how far have we come as a culture? It's only been what 156 years or something like that since slavery supposedly had stopped in our country, and maybe I don't know, was it 56 years since Civil Rights Amendment? And so you've got hundreds of years of ingrained stuff. It's really not that long for us to come. We got a long ways to go for sure. And when I first saw the original shots on the news, like Justice was saying, I'm kind of thinking, one more time, how many more times are these things going to happen? And I'm old enough to remember back watching live stuff with Rodney King, you know, what was that, 91, 92, and I was at work at the time. And, but I think one thing that kind of stuck with me initially was, is this going to be the time that there's really change? With this crap storm of a year that we've already had, and so many people dialed in on everything that's going on with social media, is this going to be the turning point? I felt a hit in my gut when I saw the initial clips, because, you know, teaching defensive tactics, I'm thinking, if anything go wrong, this whole thing is going wrong. And as DM had mentioned, if you're the partner there on scene, you would hope that you've done something different, but obviously there's a culture within that department that allowed that to happen. So I am always hesitant to try to second guess the people that are on the scene, because you don't know everything that's going on. But then eventually, when that whole clip came out and you see him kneeling there for 9 minutes, that changed my whole perspective on the thing. And honestly, I did not sleep well for several nights. And I'm just thinking, how does this happen? And how do we, as a fellow human being, do that to another human being?
Absolutely. I think there's something common that both Barry, Justice, and DM, that you guys all said, is like this sense of disbelief. Like, how does this happen? How is it 2020 and we're still having these same types of conversations? You know, like in my mind, it feels a bit regressive that we're even having a conversation about this, right? Even with everything else that's going on in the world, with, you know, the progress that we're supposed to have made as a nation, how is it still happening? And so I'm going to throw this question out to anybody who wants to jump on it. Sam and Sarah as well, just jump in. And if you guys need to pause me, feel free, because I want to make sure that your voices are the one that's heard. I'm just like kind of keeping the car on the road. But that's kind of what I wanted to start off with, is how do you think that we got here? Like, how do you think that policing became what it is today, and that we ended up with a system that allows these sorts of things to happen? How do you think we got here?
I mean, honestly, in most scenarios like this, you don't get this dramatic, not really dramatic, but extreme of a case without things happening little by little. You get a trickle in a dam, you get a crack in the system, things start getting let through. Eventually, more and more is just going to happen. And I feel like that's been the issue lately, is we had just people ignoring it until it got worse again.
Absolutely.
To the point we're at now.
Like a buildup, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, I think that there's an opposite side of that as well. And it's, I'm always big on leadership, and it trickles down from the top. And if you're seeing things from the most top leadership in our country, in our states, in our police departments, if it's acceptable at that level, it's going to be acceptable at the lower levels. I mean, just look at the same thing with parenting, you know. So if we're seeing acceptable behavior like that on all levels of, whether it be politics or whether it be in law enforcement or whatever profession we're in, it's going to trickle down. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, law enforcement's the industry or the profession that's taken the biggest hit right now, because they're probably the most public. They're the ones that's the interface between government and citizenry. But the reality is that if we really look back at how law enforcement came about, a lot of the stuff that's in law enforcement had been to suppress minorities, people of color, especially Blacks. When we look back at Jim Crow and laws that were enacted at that point, and the development of police forces to begin with, you would hope that we've kind of gotten beyond that, and certainly some laws have changed. But as I alluded to earlier, in the grand scheme of things, 54 years or 150 years is not that long to reverse generational trauma.
Absolutely. That's a huge point. And I hope we can talk on that some more as we go along with the idea of generational trauma, because this isn't, like Sam said, this is something that has been building and it has been affecting
Yeah.
many people. And we're not dealing with just George Floyd's death at this point. We are dealing with so many more injustices. So um DM or Justice, would you guys like to chime in about like just kind of how did we get here and what do you think led us to this place?
Yeah, I'll hop in on that. Honestly, I think it goes back into the early to mid 90s. Because that's around the time where they started passing bills to say, okay, police forces can take on old military surplus stuff and use it for their law enforcement services. That right there, from my perspective, is where we got away from actually wanting to police and more just wanting to dominate and shut people down. And what I mean by that is that was around the time where we gave up on actually talking to people and trying to figure out solutions to problems. And they're just like, hey, I've got enough guys, I've got enough guns, I can shut anything down. It doesn't matter the cost. And that's where we are today, basically, is there's this kind of stigma around most officers where, nobody wants to admit when things are wrong because this is just how things have been done. They just kind of fall in line and turn the blind eye to a lot. And, there are programs that a lot of departments utilize, such as crisis intervention training and things along those lines, where they're taught to use, verbal judo per se, and, they're taught to defuse high stress situations and try to talk people through things, taking people's mental health into account, of course. But like I said, there's kind of that tough guy stigma that comes with it, where you've got officers who have been on the force for decades now, have gone through all that trauma, are now showing signs of PTSD, but none of them want to step down because, their father, who was a cop, he never got PTSD. He was fine. But nobody wants to think about that as part of the issue that goes on now. I've seen some officers I worked with that their PTSD symptoms got so bad they voluntarily retired. And then I've seen some guys that I worked with that their PTSD symptoms were so bad they could nearly be committed. But because nobody else was saying anything about it, they continued to work on the force until they made mistakes or whatever it was that was reason enough for the city to get rid of them.
That's really interesting, an interesting perspective from the inside, because I will never be able to speak with expert credibility on being a cop, much as I'll never be able to speak with expert credibility or lived experience of being a Black person. But hearing your perspective on the inside is interesting, because that's something that I can't know firsthand. Before we move on, DM, did you have any thoughts on like how we got here? Or anything else you wanted to bring to the table?
I mean, man, Barry and Justice did a great job. Honestly, they said a lot of the things that I would have said and whatnot. But just to expound on it a little bit more, like Justice mentioned, they do teach you crisis intervention in your basic police academies, and they teach you verbal judo. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, type of thing. So it's in your best interest to handle a situation in more of a calm manner than barge right in and assume who's guilty and who's not guilty, when that's not the way the law is technically written. It's, innocent until proven guilty, but when in reality we see it play out as you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. So that's something that there needs to be a lot more of. And Justice is right that militarization of police force and whatnot was just a very wrong move. You're a police force, not a military. That's why there is a military. There doesn't need to be a copycat of it at a lower level, because that's essentially what it is. You're not out doing missions against foreign, entities and things like that. You're here in country, so you need to protect citizens rather than try and harm them. and then, things like the crime bill, war on drugs, those things were not in any minority's interest when they were brought up and passed and put into action. The war on drugs definitely is something that should be, brought back to the drawing table and stripped back down and figure out a better way to go about that. And get back to community policing. And I'm sure we'll get to this at another point later down the road in the call, but I'm all for police. I am. I mean, I've applied to the academy. I've toured multiple academies. I have a lot of law enforcement, close personal buddies, and I'm all for police, but I'm not for defunding them. I'm for restructuring how their funds are used, and allocating their funds in a more effective and efficient manner. And another thing that Justice had touched on, the human services aspect does need to be incorporated into everyday policing. It really does. And that's like one of my degrees is human services concentrated in criminal justice. So it makes total 360 sense to, if you can't figure out the insurance legality aspect to have a social worker on calls, you need to have them there as soon as possible after a traumatic or escalated call, or bring them in on site, while that is taking place and unfolding, if possible. Obviously, if there's gunfire and whatnot, like, you don't want to bring extra innocent bystanders in. But that's huge, because it's hard to teach somebody who's trained to be a cop another specific skill set, like, being a psychologist and, a human services advocate. That's putting too much on their plate when there's a lot on their plate already. These guys have to think calmly and slow their brains in a high stress situation, which a lot of them fail at. So they need to be taken back to the drawing board and better training in that. So yeah, I think, they need to focus more on that as well. Instead, I've seen a lot of bashing of, we'll see how that'll work, having social workers take high stress calls. And that's not at all what, they're taking it out of context. I think some, of these officers are taking it out of context. Nobody's saying throw a badge on a social worker and throw them to the wolves. It's just they need to be incorporated. There needs to be routine psych evals. Like, my opinion is, officers need to have a deeper psych eval and passing of a psych eval before even getting in to an academy, let alone, and then after the academy, refresh of that psych eval to make sure they stayed on the same mind track before going out into the field. And then psych evals, I would say, like, every quarter of the year. And then after every high stress traumatic encounter with the public, you should have to have a psych eval done within 24 hours of that. I mean, it just makes the most sense, and anybody who says that, geez, that's having to allocate a lot of funds, we're already allocating a lot of funds the wrong way with police. So that's why I said reallocation of funds.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I would love to use that as our next kind of jumping off point for conversation. I'm furiously taking notes here, and I'm hoping I keep track of some of the good stuff that we unearth in this. But one of the big kind of buzzwords over the summer has been this idea of defunding the police. And there's memes for, there's memes against, and there's memes that say, radical restructuring and reallocation of funds just doesn't fit on a protest sign. So you did something that's hashtagable. It's 2020, right? But let's talk about that idea of defunding the police, because I know for me personally, defunding the police doesn't mean I don't necessarily think we need some sort of law enforcement entity, right? And maybe, and there are people who believe in abolishing the police and doing something differently altogether. And those people have those thoughts. But this conversation is primarily about the idea of how can we partner with law enforcement, or encourage law enforcement, or drive the conversation to make this entity that we have better and more equitable. So what do you guys mean? What does defund the police mean in your head when you hear it?
Listen, when I've had this debate so many times with people that they love the hot button. They love to just do sound bites and regurgitate sound bites. And Leo, as I've mentioned to you before, I love the long format discussions because then you can really get the heart of what we really mean rather than just kind of trying to get the last word in talking past each other. But, for me, a lot of these things comes down to putting your money where the real value is at. And that's going to mean more training. And as DM was talking about, using crisis intervention teams, if you've got better training for the dispatchers and the people that are taking the phone calls, they can parse out the people that really need to be responding to these calls. What police officer becomes a police officer because they say, I want to be a social worker and deal with domestic violence and domestic, disputes issues all the time. But certainly somebody who's a social worker who can be cross-trained to have an aspect of law enforcement, not like DM said, you don't give them a badge, but you can at least go out or even in mental health issues as well, which a vast majority of people that are in jails is because of mental health issues. It's not because they're outright criminals. So if we had better training on how to figure out who should be responding to what calls, I think is going to be a big factor as well. And as Justice had referred, had mentioned, there's so many police officers with PTSD that if we had social workers that were actually trained to go to these things, they could handle the things that they're really trained to be handling. But there are some departments that have implemented crisis intervention teams, and they have social workers that are trained to respond to these things. There are some departments also who have taken police officers and trained them to specifically respond to crisis type things, not wearing uniforms and not showing up with a marked car and all those other things. But again, it's not the defunding, it's just the reallocating to really where the funds need to be going. And I think that police officers right now, that most of them want to do a good job. Most of them are good police officers, but they're just doing everything that they shouldn't necessarily be doing. They shouldn't be a jack of all trades.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge point. I feel like we send kids to college and we send young people to schools and trainings and this and that because specificity in some ways drives expertise. You know what I mean? You can't be an expert in everything. So I think there needs to be a creative reimagining or restructuring to bring some of this mental health focus and de-escalation personnel in on the the actual work of the police department. DM or Justice, did you guys have any thoughts on like what defunding means to you or what Barry said?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I had said previously, and Barry, he elaborated on it even more. It has to be reallocated. And I mean, and if I was to have like a hand in it, I'm not for defunding and stripping funding. I'm not for like just going through and screw everybody. But it needs to be reallocated and restructured. So I mean, so before reallocating, you have to restructure how a lot of departments are set up. And the way that, I mean, you can't have a local law enforcement agency that has a SORT or a SWAT team. That's state police and above. I mean, you don't need a local military. That makes no sense. That's why you have an actual military, so once you restructure, then you can reallocate those funds. And then I would say you kind of need to put, I don't want to say incentivize, but you want to put like, I guess like structured milestones almost on the reallocation of the funding. So if you meet these milestones and you use these allocations in the proper way and you make these greater strides in these, in your department, especially the departments who they have multiple guys who have multiple complaints and, infractions in their jackets, once you hit these milestones, okay, now you're eligible to get increased funding, which then has its, the bullet points on how you have to use that throughout this new structuring of your departments. I think that's like one of the best ways to, like, you know, take and then just go off of that. But I think that's how it kind of needs to be done, you know. And I listen to a couple of podcasts, not a lot, but I like to listen to Joe Rogan and Jocko Willich. And Jocko Willich is special forces, and he does a lot of leadership training. And this is one of the things that I was listening to him say when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast is, you know, you can't have police officers who are 21 years old, lived no life, had no real experiences, barely had a job. Still, most of them live at home with their parents and rely on their parents for a lot of things. And then you're going to put them in these situations, but then you have the guys that are that same age and they go into the military, they learn it the right way because they're training for 18 months, sometimes more, for a 6-month deployment. Now, how does that make sense that you train for a year and a half, 2 years for a 6-month deployment, but yet you're only training police officers 5 to 7 months is the average academy length?
And when you're deployed, you're still training.
Yeah, there's no way you'll be ready to go out on the streets. You're dealing with people in the mass amounts of people on the streets on a regular everyday basis, a lot of egos, a lot of, you know, mental disorders, a lot of issues, high stress situations. And you expect them to handle things properly. I mean, it's just, it has to be stripped back.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to be said about the length of training and the amounts of stress that officers are put under, especially when they're coming into it young. You know what I mean? I'm definitely hearing a lot of that about like training length. So, Justice, what were your thoughts on defunding?
So when I first heard, you know, when I first seen the first couple memes about defund the police, obviously from my former law enforcement experience, I was like, man, if only they knew how little money actually is circulating through officers.
Right.
But then I realized, you know, exactly what people were meaning when they were saying it, which was we want to see different alternatives to just having police to call. And I mean, I think that would be an absolutely beautiful thing. I mean, imagine if every, you know, section of a city had a community representative that could come, you know, handle neighbor disputes or, you know, come knock on your door if, you know, you're having a fight with your family just to come see, you know, make sure everybody's okay instead of immediately sending in a law enforcement officer. So from my perspective, I was all for the defund the police with that sentiment behind it. I'm not exactly for abolish the police because there are definitely circumstances that your average citizen doesn't want to have to deal with, you know, especially when we think about, you know, how many mass shootings and stuff that we've had in the last decade alone. You know, those are circumstances that the average citizen doesn't want to be called upon to come handle. However, on the flip side of that, you know, the young couple that lives next door are having a lover's quarrel. They'd much rather have a neighbor come up and be like, hey, I can hear you, you know, next door. What's going on? Is everything all right? Versus having a law enforcement officer come in, like DM said, a young person who hasn't had those type of life experiences, for example, is not going to have the same reaction as, you know, officer who's been on the force for a while, has been married for a while, understands that kind of stuff. And just the approach when you're coming up on those type of scenes, it's going to be two totally different things that you're like two totally different results you're going to get out of that. So for me personally, I was all for, you know, reallocating those funds to form different respondents for these different situations.
Hey, Justice, can you expound on what you meant by community representative? Were you talking somebody from the police department or somebody from the community? What would that look like in your mind?
In my mind, I would personally love to see that be part of a responsibility of, say, like a city council member, because they're assigned per different districts of your city anyway, so they're pretty familiar at least with where you live and where you're coming from on that regards of it. And I definitely feel it. You wouldn't want it to be somebody who's an authoritative figure for certain circumstances.
Sure.
So I think like a city council member would be perfect if you could, train them and put some funding towards that kind of stuff, and basically make it like a leader of a neighborhood watch in a sense.
Smart.
Absolutely.
I like that.
There's actually some interesting, I've been doing some interesting reading, particularly about the Black Panther Party, because like just per my personal life experience, I actually used to share space with at the internship that I worked at, the church I was a part of in Harlem. We actually shared space with a current chapter of the Black Panther Party, and it really intrigued me. And I did some reading about like their structure, and it really made me realize that there were whole ways that Black communities were creating amongst themselves to creatively handle the idea of self-moderation within their communities. And I feel like that's what we need moving forward in this conversation, is a truly genuine, creative session to solve problems with things that don't maybe already exist, Sarah, I think you had a question, correct?
Yeah, either for DM or Justice, how long do you think training should be for a police officer? You said most of the time it's too short. So what would your idea of a training length be?
I'll let Justice go first on that.
So that's kind of a tough one, and it's actually a question that I pondered to a few of the guys I went through the academy with, when we were all said and done. So the academy I went through was, I believe it was 16 weeks. So that's 4 months. That's not long at all. Like when you really break it down. And then Virginia Beach Police Department, their academy was about 6 months. And I believe Virginia State Police, their academy was about 8 months, give or take. The issue we found was the longer you make that academy, the less likely you are to have people that either make it through or even want to apply to begin with. But then the other side of that coin is that's not at all long enough for even some of the situations I dealt with, a month out of the academy. And the funny thing was towards the end of the academy, some of your instructors would tell you, hey, you're going to learn most of your stuff on the job, so just fake it till you make it. And it's like, that's fine for certain things, but I feel like when it comes to law enforcement, I want that officer to know everything there is to know to get us through that situation as safely as possible with, minimal damage done. So me personally, I think a 2-year academy is completely reasonable, because that shows that person has the dedication, and that also gives you plenty of time to evaluate where their heart's at with, trying to get into law enforcement, because we've seen it time and time again, the couple bad guys that slip through the cracks and do, really terrible things. For example, Officer Chauvin, he made it through almost a 20-year career and then basically committed a modern day lynching for the world to see, where, you have some people who they don't even make it through the first 30 days of the academy just because of the demands that's being put on them for the first time in their life.
So can I jump in here and ask a question, Leo? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So Justice, excuse my ignorance here, but I just kind of thought about this. A lot of professional professions, which I think law enforcement would be considered, I had to take a board exam before I started my practice. Leo, I'm sure you had to do something. You go through school, you still have to do a certification exam. Is that something that happens in law enforcement, or is it just that you graduate the academy and now you're able to apply for a job? Is there some sort of national certification that has to happen?
Yeah, so all law enforcement across the United States have to be what is called DCJS certified. So it's a section of the DOJ that they basically made the curriculum for what it takes to become a law enforcement officer. And there's different levels to that. Like I said, that is a big factor in what makes those academy lengths vary. So, say for like, if you want to go work at your local city jail, your academy usually is right around the 8-week mark. And that's about how long it takes for them to, you know, get you in the physical shape to work in the correction center and get you to know enough to be able to pass those standardized tests. And for my academy specifically, it was set up just like any like state standardized testing. So, you know, like the Scantron sheet, they've give you out the booklets, you hand them all back when you're done, and then you leave the room so everybody else can finish. So there are standards for it, but it will also vary state to state. So like me working in Virginia is a Commonwealth. So my academy there for what I was doing was a little bit longer than what it would have been if I had done it up here in New York State.
Okay, so there's some variance in there is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right on. So what do we think what do you think, DM, in terms of length? Like, do you see there being a way that we could pull a common thread, like nationally? Do you think it would be a federal thing? Do you think it would be a state thing? How do you think that we could increase or restructure in terms of length of training times?
Well, I'll start off by saying I loved a lot of what Justice said. I really did, and I agree with a lot of what he said. To start out with what you just said, as far as like federal, you threw that out there. My thinking with a lot of different things, you know, some of them are the prevalent issues that are going on right now. If the government likes to have their nose in a lot of different things that they should not have their nose in, then they need to get their nose in the right things. Like, you know, if everybody's going to be okay with the government having a say in things, it needs to be, you know, them having a say in the right things, you know. And if it's going to be law enforcement, I wouldn't be mad to see the federal government like put out a structuring, like, you know, something that's across the board that every state has to go with, every local municipality. That's how their academies have to be structured. Because, you know, I agree with Justice. The longer that you have an academy, you lose a lot of possible participants and, you know, guys and women that sign up to go. So, I mean, then you run the risk of getting yourself into a situation of you had a thin academy the last one. Now you're having a thin one again. Now you've got a lot of guys that are getting overworked. Now you play into that more stress situations because these guys are working more hours and they're not getting new, fresh faces in to help fill some of these shifts to be able to give them more time with their families or whatever the case might be. So you have a lot of different things that affect other things with that. But I mean, I think the best play out is to have, like Justice said, at least at minimum a 2-year academy. I mean, it needs to be like a degree. And I don't mean like, you know, a 70 is passing and you get out and that's cool. That's great. Clap, you know, your family comes to your graduation, you made it out. Like, no, I mean, like you got to pass with like at least an 85 or better, because that weeds out the guys who really, you know, they might be an okay candidate and they can get the job done, but then you run the risk with those guys of burning out faster. They might not have the whole heart in it. They might not have the moral fiber and the thread that needs to, you know, come into play. And one of my thinkings is like in plumbing, Australians, so far in my knowledge, like take the cake with plumbing, because I know an Australian guy who he's right here in town and he works for another plumbing outfit and they get a degree and they go through a lot of like training and whatnot, you know. So how can you have that for something like plumbing, but you can't have that for somebody who's rocking around a 9, a 40, or a 45 on their hip every day and can possibly take out 15 people per clip or per mag, you know? So I think, you know, Justice is spot on that a minimum of a 2-year degree along with academy, because I had the luxury and I guess the you know, the ability to, I toured the Columbus, Ohio police department and academy, and they're legit. And it's funny because I've been to our own Cat County, and I don't want to go as far as saying it's a joke, but I mean, I'm not impressed. When you stand it up against somebody like Columbus, I mean, their facilities are top notch. The way they train is top notch. I mean, they're doing DT every week throughout the entire academy. Our academy, that's not even close to being the same. It's about a week.
Okay.
You know,
I
the both you guys make a good point as far as, so if you got a 2-year training, there's gonna be a higher attrition rate. People aren't gonna make it through. People aren't gonna want to continue, but you're gonna have more professionals that are on the job, gonna be able to handle the job much more effectively, much more efficiently. There's probably gonna be better work environment because people are gonna want to be there because they're really there for the long haul. But also simultaneously, you know, DM, you had mentioned that there's probably going to be fewer people to do the tasks. But if you've already farmed out some of that stuff so that they're not responding to every domestic violence or mental health call, then you can kind of share the wealth as far as the calls go and maybe not need to have so many people covering so many calls. But if we hold them to that higher standard of being professionals, I think most police officers want to be professionals. They want to be considered professionals. They want to be paid as a professional. So
Yep.
be a professional.
I think it's funny that you touched on that because I was having those same thoughts go through my head, Barry, is that like, so yes, you would lose some folks, but perhaps that someone who commented on the feed just mentioned something about how we could improve hiring practices to like weed out people who weren't fit for the job, or to find people that are fit for the job but might not traditionally apply. And I feel like that tweaking of the hiring process could possibly be dovetailed with a changing requirement for the length of time. You know what I mean? It seems like all of those things could go together, if you ask me.
And I think standardization of the training, like DM had said, I mean, look at the dichotomy between the two police departments he was talking about, or police academies he was talking about, as far as defensive tactics training.
Yes.
You know, and if you're not proficient there, then you're always going to be wanting to use your most lethal force possible because you're not proficient in the other things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So something that I noticed while you guys were talking, and this wasn't on the list, this is just something I'm picking up from hearing everybody's 2 cents so far, you know, is it seems like there's kind of 2 places where police reform needs to happen. It seems like there needs to be some legislative changes as well as interdepartmental changes. And so it seems to me like, you know, we have this idea of a standardization, whether it's state to state or like a federal something, and then each state has to figure out how they meet that requirement or something like that. But it seems like there also needs to be a change within departments. Like Justice said, how there's that pervasive tough guy mentality. I was doing some reading about the statistics of police officers. Their average life expectancy seems to be about 22 years younger than someone that is not a police officer. The burnout rate seems to be one of the higher in professions. So it seems like there needs to be both legislative changes and interdepartmental changes that need to take place. Do you guys have, now this is a little bit of a switching of topics. Also, for the record, I'm taking notes on what exact steps that we've come up with that we think need to be addressed, because I'd like to wrap up our conversation in tangibles. But before we do that, I found something really interesting when I was listening to the presidential debate, this most recent presidential debate. There has been some talk about the war on drugs, and, you know, kind of the shift that happened in the 90s with regards to policing and militarization and the way things are sentenced and such. There's been a lot of talk like about Joe Biden's role in the war on drugs and in the mandatory minimum installation of those. Did anybody happen to catch Joe Biden's apology for the crime bill at the last debate? And if so, what did you think about it? How did it sit with you?
I couldn't get past the first segment of the debate that I shut it off. So
Basically, what happened was there was a segment about race and policing, and the moderator specifically asked Joe Biden, you know, you were in, I believe it was '94, you were a proponent of the increased crime bill and mandatory minimums, and Joe Biden essentially said that was a mistake. It is not working, and we need to continue to fix the damage that has been done by that. And so I was just wondering if anyone caught that and had any thoughts on it.
you know, hey, I was just talking with my wife about this earlier today. And the funny thing is, in politics, it seems like you're not allowed to change your mind. You're not allowed to say I was wrong. And hey, from a science background, I mean, that's what drives what you do in science, right? You want to be proven wrong so that you advance the body of knowledge. And so it's funny how that's not allowed to happen in politics. So if he said that, kudos to him, because I think that the war on drugs has been a failure. And we've got so many people that are in jails and prisons right now for nonviolent crimes, and you know, all these people that are in jail for having a little bit of pot. It's, to me, it's just been a big failure, and so it's kind of contributed to a lot of the stuff that's going on right now. And
Absolutely.
so
Awesome.
the whole thing needs to be rethought, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was what came through my mind when I was thinking about the legislative piece of things, is legislation that did and didn't help the cause of moving towards equitable policing and equitable justice, you know. I have a question for Justice. What did you see as a CO and a law enforcement officer from within the system that you feel needs to be changed? If you had to put like a number one priority on there from your experience, what would that be? Oh, we got you on mute still, my man. Oh, there we go, Justice.
I don't know. It's kind of a tough one, because there's like, so many of these issues are multifaceted. And sometimes, from my experience, where you think there should be a clean and easy solution to fix something, you realize there's, 10 or 12 other things that also cause that same negative effect. But for me personally, if I really had to boil it down to one thing, I would say mandatory minimums were, kind of the death of the criminal justice system ever being fair. And I say that because a mandatory minimum completely takes the power out of the judge's hands to make an actual fair and concise judgment based on all of the facts at hand, which is what the judge was placed there to do. And the reason why, to be a judge, you got to have, pass the bar exam and have some experience in the courtrooms.
Absolutely.
So for me, that's the biggest one. Because I seen mandatory minimum end some guys' military careers who were, 18, 19 years old, never been out of their hometown, and all of a sudden they're thrown into, one of the busiest metropolitan areas in the country next to DC, because it's just below DC, For those of you that don't know, Virginia Beach is part of an area of Virginia called Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads is made up by 7 cities. And I think the smallest of those cities is still along the lines of like 80 to 100,000 people. So, you get these guys who come from small towns like where we're from, they don't know exactly how things work when they get down there. They, go out drinking with their unit, whatever. Most of them are military, like I said, and mandatory minimum. Now their military career shot, something that could have been as easy as, hey, spend a weekend in jail, pay a fine, now turns into, okay, now you're serving 90 days plus, you've got X amount of fines that you're going to have to come up with, and now you don't have a career, you're far away from home. Like, those things I would have loved to see. I'd love to see mandatory minimums gone and everything handled as a case-by-case basis, personally.
Absolutely. I think that also lends to a certain amount of despair and apathy amongst like people who are having an interaction with the justice system as well. So I think that creates like it creates a higher level of tension between citizens and officers. At least that would be what it would seem from my perspective.
Didn't that whole minimum sentence stuff come about with the whole law and order dog whistle that was being used? It's also being blown about right now.
Mhm.
So it's, I don't want to tread on that too much, but it seems, because we could be talking on that all night. But it's all kind of part and parcel with that whole political football that was bantered about.
I think you're correct, absolutely correct too, because mandatory minimums are predatory. And strike rules are predatory, and it's just this thing where arbitrary rules are applied so that we can look really tough on crime, which really isn't great for society. It's really just great on a boilerplate speech of a candidate. And so then you have, I think, what like DM talked about, maybe the government having too much of their nose in a situation, just a thought, but you are right. We could talk about that all night. So one thing I would like to talk, and I'd like to bring Barry in on this little segment here, is one of the reasons that we asked Barry to be a part of this conversation is Barry has expertise in leading de-escalation trainings for police forces. And one of the main questions and ideas that we got as something that people wanted to hear about tonight was use of force, overuse of force, use of deadly force, how to, how to change the way that interactions happen when there is a necessary level of physical response. So Barry, what are your thoughts on defensive tactics for police, ways to change encounters so that situations aren't so inflammatory? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, this is one of those topics we could talk on all night, because I think a lot of stuff we're talking about is really a symptom of a much larger issue that we're dealing with right now. As Justice, I think, alluded to before, there's certainly the verbal judo. We call it verbal jujitsu for obvious reasons. We do jujitsu, and jujitsu is a little bit more comprehensive. But so there's the verbal aspect of de-escalation that obviously most people are aware of. And I think, as both DM and Justice had mentioned, if we increase the training at the academy level, and they actually have blocks of instruction on the verbal tactics of de-escalation, that's one component. But what I think is sorely missing in the defensive tactics training, for those that don't know, defensive tactics is generally referring to the empty hand type training before you're using lethal force, because there's generally 5 different levels of use of force. Bottom tier is basically a compliant suspect or a compliant citizen, and then you've got passive resistant and active resistant, and as it goes up. And so if you come in at one level of resistance, then the way it's kind of trained now is that you use the next level up to try to de-escalate the situation. But again, as Justice had mentioned, when you've got this mindset that's more of a warrior mindset as opposed to a guardian mindset, then it's always going to be one-upmanship. And so you're trying to control fire with fire. And I think we really need to try to controlling fire with water. And so doing more defensive tactics training of controlling the suspect, once you've gotten past the verbal part I'm talking about, you couldn't talk them off the ledge. You couldn't de-escalate it with your verbal jujitsu or your verbal judo. The defensive tactics part is if law enforcement was training more often on defensive tactics. Unfortunately, they go to the academy, they get quote unquote defensive tactics at the academy, depending on the academy they go to, as DM mentioned. Some are doing it on a weekly basis, some get a week block. Most of it is archaic and outdated and outmoded and isn't going to work in 2020 when everybody and their brother thinks they're a UFC champion. So you've got to have training where the law enforcement officers are comfortable with the physical contact. They're comfortable with going to the ground, so they don't feel like they've got to be pulling their handgun out to to stop the scenario. So there are defensive tactics that what we do when we're doing, when I say we, I'm talking about myself and my staff, that when we do defensive tactics training, the law enforcement officers that we talk to, the stuff that we're presenting, the vast majority of the time, they're saying, I wish I would have had this before. How come we're not getting this at the academy? I don't know, because the guys that are teaching you probably aren't doing it 60 hours a week like we are. You know, so we get to explore with things that other people don't. So again, as I alluded to earlier, I think that there ends up needing to be more training. Once they get out of the academy, maybe they're getting 4 to 6 hours a year of refresher stuff, if that's really happening. You know, a lot of times it's kind of read and sign this, that you did your training, and there's really no real follow-up training. And so I think they ought to be doing weekly defensive tactics training where they're really getting out and they're really doing some groundwork. They're really learning how to defend themselves on the ground. How did they retain their weapon? Should there end up being a scuffle? How do they end up controlling it so that they don't have to immediately going to lethal force? And that way they're comfortable. Now, obviously, as GM had mentioned, now you've got, you know, other things and budgetary restraints and all these other things that go into it that are going to say, okay, we can't allocate these funds for weekly training. Maybe it ought to be monthly, maybe it ought to be quarterly. But to say 4 hours a year, that's crazy. But yet we're going to allow them to go out with a handgun and certify with that. And they do their shooting at the range. They got to qualify with that, but they're not going to qualify with something that they're going to be doing more often. I think it's a huge oversight. I think it's a gross miscarriage of what we need to be doing here to really make it so that not only our citizens are safe, but our officers are safe as well. Because if we take some of these things away from them and they're uncomfortable with that physical confrontation, what are they going to go to first? The most lethal weapon they've got, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
That's not even talking about, you know, chokes and all that other stuff, because I probably think totally different than what most people do when we talk about should chokes be banned. And if you want to talk about that, we can talk about that as well. But maybe we want to get some other people's, you know, thoughts on what we just touched on.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts on what Barry was saying? Because this was a big piece about why I wanted to invite him in. He does have experience in teaching and training law enforcement officers in de-escalation tactics. So I would love to see what everybody else thought, or if you guys had questions for Barry.
But one more point on that. I think that we could also be doing defensive tactics training for those social workers that ought to be brought on.
Absolutely.
You know, so that should something go awry, that they got some skills and maybe even some less than lethal weapons, maybe taser, maybe pepper spray or something that they could also use. Just a thought.
Yeah. No, I agree with Barry. I mean, and I think BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is like, that should be, like Barry said, that should be something that is kept up regularly. Actually, by law enforcement.
We do, and our what we teach for our jiu-jitsu is not BJJ.
No.
Because ours includes striking and kicking as well. It's jiu-jitsu, it's the grappling. It includes the grappling of BJJ, but it's actually more comprehensive than that. But at least you get law enforcement so they're used to that. Because if you haven't been punched, you haven't been hit, somebody hasn't thrown you to the ground, and you're not used to that, you're going to freak out.
Yeah, everybody thinks they're a tough guy until they get punched in the face, Mike Tyson.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's true, though. It's true. I mean, there's a lot of guys. I've had this conversation with some of the, you know, a couple of the guys that are Leos that I know, and it's, if you're within 3 feet of me, I've already hit you twice before you can uphold. I've already hit you twice. Like, I mean, you know, for being a big guy, like, my hands are fast. Mm-hmm. So, and that's, I mean, and I'm not even like an athlete, you know, I'm like a regular condition trained athlete. Imagine some of those people who are like training at a high level all year round, and then they get into an altercation with an officer. That spells bad news for a cop. That spells bad news. I mean, so Barry's right. I mean, a lot of guys, they get into shape to get into the academy, they get through the academy, and then they get out of shape because there's no testing at a periodic time frame. You know, it should be at least every quarter you have to re-qual your run along with your range. If you have to qual at range twice or 3 times a year, whatever that department has it set as, you should have to re-qual for your run and your push-ups and your sit-ups and everything like that along with it. And if you don't, then it looks like you're suspended without pay until you can qual. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, I think that's a big thing.
Yeah.
It would seem to me like there are so many professions that require fairly stringent amounts of continuing education credits or recertifications or this or that, that it would seem to me that that would have already been happening in terms of law enforcement. So I have so many thoughts going through my head right now, but this is such an important thing because I feel like this just naturally should already be happening. And I think that what you said, Barry, about offering that de-escalation training to that transitional or liaison position would be huge, because perhaps there is an actual dual funded position between nonprofit agencies and officers where you have a person who wants to live in that intersection of law enforcement and social work. Maybe there are those people, you know. This is an idea that someone brought up to me, and I'd just be curious to hear what your thoughts are in terms of ideas that could be enacted for police reform. And it's just a quick question, but have you guys heard or thought about the idea of like a personal insurance waiver for law enforcement officers? Because I know there are many professions where you have to have insurance to practice your profession. You have to have insurance as a counselor. You have to have insurance as an accountant. You have to have insurance.
We lost you there, Leo. We lost your audio.
Nothing.
Nope. Lost you, buddy. I think I know what Leo was getting at, so let's just try to pick up the conversation, I guess. Leo, are you there yet?
I can hear you. Can
There you
guys hear
go.
me?
There you go.
Perfect. There you go.
All right, I was gonna take the conversation over here. So.
Barry's in the driver's seat. See you guys later.
No, what I was starting to say is I think I know where you were going with that in talking about having liability insurance, or for me, it was malpractice insurance, right? Fortunately, I'd never had to use it. But I had thought about that before, and I can't remember who I was having the discussion with, because we're talking about police unions as well. And, if that was modified and that was changed, what if police officers, maybe Leo was with you, I was having that discussion with.
I think so.
If law enforcement had some sort of malpractice insurance and they had to carry it themselves, and, they get sued, and eventually, if you get sued too many times, the malpractice carrier is going to drop you. You don't have the insurance, you don't get to be employed. That's an interesting thought. I like your idea there.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit for it. Someone else posted it on an ORJC post way back, but I just thought it was an intriguing idea. There would be so many logistics to it, but I was like, it was one of those things that
professions do it though. Other professions deal with the logistics with more. I would suspect there's probably more people in medicine and more people in cosmetology or whatever that there's law enforcement. They can deal with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's companies that love it.
Yeah. There's companies that love it. This is absolutely true. We touched on this idea, and it seems like it can be an incendiary idea here. So fair warning, we're all stepping into this together. What are your thoughts on chokeholds, Barry? I mean, you're someone who's an expert in self-defense, sans weapons, and I mean, and with weapons too. But what are your thoughts on it? Is there a nuance that we don't know as the general public?
I don't know about you don't know, but I think a lot of the general public doesn't know. And I think the problem comes down with use of terms. And a lot of people don't understand what it is that you're doing with specific quote unquote chokes. And there's airway chokes, and then there's vascular neck restraints. And airway choke, you're actually crushing or attacking the trachea and the air going in from the mouth and nose to the lungs, as opposed to a vascular neck restraint, which is attacking both sides of the neck, not the airway, and constricting the carotid arteries going to the brain. If I choke you or I attack your airway, it's going to take a long time, quite a while, for you to pass out and probably die. But I could do a vascular neck restraint and you be passed out in 6 to 10 seconds, have you cuffed, and if I let go like I'm supposed to, because I'm trained properly, the person regains consciousness and life is good. On a very rare occasion, somebody can get injured with a vascular neck restraint. But look, every day, thousands of times every day, people are in martial arts schools, jiu-jitsu schools, we're rolling and we're doing it all the time. And rarely is there an issue because we're trained all the time on when to let go. But if you're only trained at the academy and then maybe 4 hours a year and you're freaking out because you're not sure what to do, and you get somebody in a neck restraint and you're so upregulated and so amped up that you don't know when to let go, that's going to be a problem. But to me, the more training there is, the less liability. So the technique is as safe as the training of the user. So I am not a fan of banning all chokes, vascular neck restraints, because if you take that one technique away, you're asking law enforcement now to use what's their next lethal weapon. You want to get shot when you could have just been choked out?
Yeah.
You know, so I come from a little different perspective than a lot of people do because I understand the difference between the two, and we use them all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have expertise on the matter, and that's why I was curious to know, because
So,
I didn't personally know.
Yeah, so I think that if you're only being trained, you know, at the academy, and you're really not doing the training that a lot of departments say that they're doing, maybe you ought to not be using it as a less than lethal force, but, you know, move it up the ladder to lethal force. That's the only time you can use it.
Mhm.
But if they're training more frequently, like we're talking about here, I think it could be an integral part of their repertoire, you know, a technique that they could use if they know how to use it, how to defend against it as well, but also when to stop and when to let go. So I think that if it's taught properly by people who really know how to do it, and it's used appropriately, and as I think DM had mentioned early on, if you've got your partner who's standing by and seeing, okay, the guy's passed out, stop, then I think I think it is a useful tool. My concern is that if you take that tool away, you're asking to use the next most lethal weapon you've got to stop the assault. Because look, every time that there's an interaction between law enforcement and a civilian, there's always a gun involved. You know, and if you've got somebody who does not want to get hauled off to jail and they're scrapping on the ground, are they going to be going for that handgun? Most likely, yeah. And so the law enforcement officer has to be able to retain that. They've got to be able to control the suspect in order to cuff them and take them into custody.
Absolutely.
I don't know. What do you think, Justice? You're the law enforcement guy.
Yeah.
So for me, I 110% agree with Barry on. I think everybody should know jujitsu. Period. I mean, it's a great thing to know what to do when someone actually has hands on you, and not to feel panicked or not to feel, you know, that adrenaline dump that makes you make bad decisions. But so the department I worked for, chokeholds were already banned a few years before I had gotten there. And when we were going through our DT portion of the academy, one of our DT instructors had told us, hey, this is completely off the table until you're at that deadly use of force situation. And once you're at that deadly use of force, nothing's off the table at that point. It's really just, you need to survive that fight. But I agree with Barry also that I don't think chokeholds should be taken off the table, because when I think about, having to be in a physical altercation with somebody, I would rather be choked unconscious than to be shot or to be, bludgeoned with, a baton or whatever else there is at hand. And just to jump back to one of our earlier subjects, I think if officers had more training in the hand-to-hand aspect of their DTs, you would see these bad instances drop down instantly. I mean, to get back to what DM was saying about Jocko Willink there, he was saying, he'd like to see every cop be a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, because at a purple belt, you're not necessarily a master, but you have the confidence and you also know what it's like to be on the receiving end at that point of the moves that you may be employing. And that's a big thing also. That's a huge part of why, you have to get pepper sprayed. If your department carries tasers, you got to get hit with that taser so you know what it's like. I think it goes the same way when it comes to the DTs. I think that when it comes to hand, you 110% should be, fully knowledgeable of what you're doing and knowledgeable of how to, inflict the minimal amount of force necessary to accomplish whatever your task is.
Absolutely. I think there has to be, I think it seems from what you guys are saying that it's a completely legitimate move if you're trained in it. And that if we were to increase the training, it would increase the level of accountability, basically. I know Sam and Sarah both have some thoughts. So let's start with Sarah and then we'll go to Sam and just throw out your thoughts on the idea here.
Yeah, Leo, just going off like what you just said, I think if it goes right back to being properly trained and emphasizing that, because your first thought as a cop shouldn't be, well, I can't choke this person properly, so I'm going to grab my gun, because that just gets us back to square one and nothing changes. And it also kind of goes back to my thoughts on longer trainings, like a 2-year, lost my train of thought.
Well, kind of like an associate degree back, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
More substantial.
Yeah, basically my thought would be, if you're really trained on it for a long period of time, then it shouldn't be an issue. But that really just needs to be emphasized, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it would seem that if you are trained, there's a lot of things you can do with effectiveness when you're trained in them, right? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that are dangerous to do when you're not trained in them. I mean, even when I worked as a direct service professional at the rehab center or in tandem, we had to do certain amounts of holds before training, and then we had to recertify on them regularly. And I'm taking care of people in their homes. So,
Right.
Sam, what were your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I feel it is very important for the training of it, and that we shouldn't really abolish it. My main concern is just somebody misusing it when they shouldn't be using it, or even using it as their advantage to get the upper hand on somebody who they quite aren't at that state where they need to do something about it. Them, even if we train them, the issue of them getting that, like, essentially that hunger for the power, and taking it to where we can't get that, like a second officer can't get them off that person. And what we would do to get what a second officer could even do to get them off of them, to the point where, like, we don't have another instance where an innocent person is being killed based on a type of chokehold. And obviously, if they are trained, it is less likely to happen because of misuse. But my worry is more so them using it as a power tactic.
I think
I
that would
think-
come back to where DM was talking about before of having psychological evaluations, which I think is totally appropriate because you have it for other, and I think most law enforcement or most academies do have that to a certain degree, a psychiatric evaluation before they go to the academy. But there probably needs to be periodic follow-ups with that as well. And I totally agree with you, Sam, where you're talking about using that as the upper hand. But that's why I was saying earlier that if law enforcement officers had more training and they're using the de-escalation techniques, the physical techniques of controlling the suspect, they wouldn't have to go to a neck restraint if they knew how to do that. Unfortunately, from what I'm seeing and the departments that we're training, is they're not getting that in part of their DT training. They're not getting it at the academy. But because we do it all the time, that's our job, that's what we do. It's just second nature to us. So we teach it in our defensive tactics programs that we teach. And so it makes it much more easier for the law enforcement officers to be rolling around on the ground, to be able to control the suspects so they're not reaching for the gun, and so the gun is not in play, hopefully, or the taser for that matter.
There you go. DM, you had said something earlier in your initial thought, how like you wished you could be, Officer Chauvin's partner. And there were some questions on the Facebook page about like how should a partner react if a partner is having sort of an overreach moment or a power trip moment. And that kind of, those two thoughts all roll together with something that I wanted to bring up before we wrap this up here. So this will be like towards the end of our questions, but how can we, do you have any ideas, and we'll start with you, DM, ideas on like increasing accountability between officers, right? Because there's this idea of like, there's kind of this idea of like, backing up, an officer regardless. And there's this union mentality and there's this group thought, but how can we, how could, what sort of changes could be enacted to create that accountability between partners? And what could a partner do in that moment to be able to influence that situation, like that interrelational, interdepartmental accountability?
Yeah. I think it just comes down to, the officer who is the partner in that moment being comfortable and being reassured by their training, and it solidified within them that no harm's going to come from me. I'm not going to get written up. I'm not going to get shunned by my superiors. I'm not going to get shunned by my peers. I'm not going to get shunned by anybody within the department for if I do, not back him up, not back her up, whoever it is that is in the wrong in that instance. So, if we're talking about, the George Floyd situation where Chauvin flat out murdered him, in a couple of the angles, it looked like maybe one of the other officers might have like gestured or said something, but I can't say, I wasn't there in real time. But they should have. I mean, you could, if it was me at first, you got this guy already restrained and then you're on his neck. That plays back to like what Barry was saying, as far as chokeholds go, I'm all for chokeholds. Like, fun fact, my favorite's a rear naked or a darce. Love them, love them. I got long arms. So but if you have somebody restrained, that should be like flat out, you're fired. Flat out, you're fired. Like turn everything in. You keep nothing. Like turn everything in. You can't have someone restrained and then you're also choking them. It could be an airway choke or a choke of the carotid. Like either way, you're done. You're fired on the spot. So if it were me in that situation, I would have walked up and put a firm hand on his shoulder and turned him back to look at me, while also with my other hand bending down to like pull his knee away from his neck and saying, hey, let's back off this situation. Let's regroup. He's restrained. Let him lay there and let's regroup and get this figured out. Let's clear our minds up right now. And if he didn't want to and he still wanted to go there, I'm sorry, but he then himself has to get choked out. I'm choking my own partner out in that instance, because at this point, he's gone to the level of he wants to ignore every right thought there could possibly be to come through his mind. He wants to go with the pure, sheer evil, off the deep end approach. So if he's my partner and he wants to ignore that, you know, I'm just pulling him back. Hey, let's regroup. If you want to ignore that, then I got to choke you out. And it is, you know, it is what it is at that point. You know, and if you're trained properly, goes back to what Barry said, and that's why you want to train regularly. It's the same thing with firearms, you know, anything physical, muscle, mind connection, and, you know, repetition, you know, the memory of it within your building into your muscle. So if you're trained properly, you should never really worry about choking someone out too long to where you could kill them. You know, you have that muscle memory to where, okay, they should be out now. And you let off. It just built in. Boom, you let off. And then you obviously stay cautious in case, you know, you have, you know, someone who's on drugs or just a random, you know, freak of nature that it didn't affect them like what you thought it was going to, and they pop right back up on you. But that would be my take as far as, you know, accountability, to make it known, I guess, that if you decide to go down those dark avenues as an officer of the law, and you don't want to hold it up to show people I follow the law, I'm not above the law, you know, and I'm going to treat you fairly and accordingly, and, you know, you want to go down those avenues, as your partner or a fellow officer, I have to make it very known and blatant to you. I cannot support you. If you get yourself into a deadly force situation, you're on your own. You know, I can't put myself at jeopardy, my family at jeopardy, the rest of the force at jeopardy. I can't do that. So the more officers that take that type of mindset and course of action against the officers who do want to just run roughshod and do whatever they feel like, the better off the departments will be, you know, as far as accountability standpoint. People knowing if I do this, I might be screwed with the rest of the department. You know, I'm going to be kind of, you know, shunned.
Yeah. Justice, now I have a question for you as someone, and this is my last question before I ask our final series, which I'm going to ask everybody. So everybody get ready, do a shot, smoke your cigarette, do whatever you need to do to get yourself ready to be on the spot. But Justice, before we head there, I just have a question for you, like coming from someone who was, you know, actively a law enforcement officer and a CO, what do you think could be done to like increase or encourage that sense of accountability, like in both directions? So not just like I have my partner's back, but I have the back of the person who may or may not be being wrongfully restrained. Like, what do you think could be changed? Because this is, once again, it's a legislative thing and it's a departmental thing. It's a rule thing and it's a heart thing. It's a training thing, and it's a cultural thing. What's something like, do you have any insight on that from an inside perspective as someone who's had a partner? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So obviously working in corrections, you know, there's quite a few instances where you're doing, you know, cell extractions and you're having uses of force and stuff like that. And I've been in this situation before with somebody who is senior to me. You know, we get the person on the ground, we're trying to get into position to get them cuffed, and they're actively fighting. And when they go to put that knee in their back, they didn't realize, but they were too high up and it went towards the back of the person's neck. So me being new in that instance, I had no idea what was going on because I'm tunnel vision and I'm just focused on, you know, what I'm trying to control. And luckily for us in that instance, we had a supervisor that was holding a camera over our shoulder because that's how we did things in our facility. whenever we had to do cell extraction, everything goes on video. And the supervisor said, you know, hey, move your knee down. And then boom, that's all that person needed to know, like, oh man, I'm in the wrong position, let me move. But sometimes when you're locked in, you get that tunnel vision, like I said, you know, adrenaline's going, especially if you're new and, you know, this is one of your first times having to do this, you're not going to have any clue of what's going on. So I think that always having, I guess, kind of like somebody playing a referee type role is a beautiful thing to have. You know, somebody who can tell you, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're going to injure them, move over, whatever it is that needs to take place on that part. Later on in my career, we had other situations where people who were, you know, people who I was senior to, you know, now when we're in a use of force situation, a good friend of mine, I had to physically pull him off and, you know, basically tag him out because I could see he was getting to the point mentally where he was ready to escalate versus de-escalate. Now, that was something I only felt comfortable to do because, like I said, him and I were close friends. But if it were anybody else who I wasn't senior to or who I didn't believe had the capabilities of handling that, me personally, I was pulling them out and, you know, telling them, hey, tag out, you know, you're done, take a breather, go write up the report, whatever it was I needed to do to get them out of that situation to help de-escalate. Another thing that I think would be huge to help with avoiding those situations as a whole, I think you have to get rid of the idea of internal affairs and it needs to turn into external affairs. You know, you got to have somebody who's not directly in that mix doing an overview of everything and making sure, you know, if this person has, you know, they messed up on a use of force, boom, they need to instantly go, you know, take DT refreshers, you know, give them X amount of time off, let them kind of come down and refocus and see where they're at, and then do those mental evaluations at that point and say, you know, hey, thank you for your service, but, you know, at this point in time, you're not fit for duty, pull them out. And then that really gets rid of a lot of your issues. And with the internal affairs thing, that's a really dangerous game that we play in our criminal justice system, is allowing the police to police themselves on certain matters. Now, the idea behind that is basically just, well, if you haven't lived it, you're not going to fully understand it. Now that I've lived it, I can say, you know, I agree in certain circumstances, but whenever there's any type of grievous bodily harm, I think that needs to go to an external review board. Or anytime, you know, somebody's really injured, or, you know, heaven forbid if there is a death, all those things need to go to an external review source.
I think that would absolutely make sense. I mean, otherwise you're, like you said, the police are policing themselves and then no one else is. So thank you guys so much, DM and Justice, you know, obviously Barry, thank you guys for your thoughts on that question. And I just have one question I'd like to wrap up with. And this is going to come from all of you guys. I've actually been writing down specific tangibles. You can see them on here. These are our exact steps that we've kind of mined from this conversation of what could be recommended. But as I'm pretty sure most of us know, because I think I've actually talked to each one of you individually about this idea, it was mandated by Governor Cuomo that each department come up with a plan for police reform, and April is our deadline. We haven't heard very much about this from our area. Our city council was kind of, originally when this topic came up, it was all police reform, and then there was the idea of the diversity committee, and we haven't really heard any more about police reform. And so I would kind of like to hear you guys' ideas, 2 or 3 or 7 or 1, however many ideas you have. But what do you think are some specific changes that need to be pushed for as a part of our local police reform? Because I would love to see out of this conversation, I would love to see a list of tangible asks that we could take to a city council meeting and say, this is something that we have crowdsourced and these are ideas we have had. I would love to hear some thoughts on your tangibles, and I'll be writing them down as well. So whoever wants to start.
So for me, the biggest thing with the review board idea that I think has to take place. You have to have people who have had quite a few interactions with law enforcement. Like, we can't have just squeaky clean, perfect community members sitting on this board, because that's the same idea as, allowing a bunch of, wealthy people to decide if you should have affordable health care. They don't actually care if you should have affordable health care because they can afford it. It's the same idea of, if we put a bunch of squeaky clean, community members on this board, not a single one of them has had the interactions with law enforcement that these boards are hoping to prevent.
That's really, really good, Justice. I hadn't even thought of that idea, but you're incredibly correct. It has to, or we'll just get the same,
Exactly.
Who wants to go next?
Go ahead, DM.
Yeah, no, I agree with Justice. But it's like one of the things that you had just mentioned. We can't have police policing themselves in too many instances. Actually, it should be a no instance. Should the police have the ability to, figure out their own course of action and reprimanding an officer in a situation where they could be at fault. And I mean, I can't really say that that's like an overly infectious issue with our area department. I mean, I know so many of the guys, I really do.
That's
and
fair.
A lot of the guys are really good guys. Like, I like a lot of them. But I'd be remiss to say that I don't believe that some of them do need, to have that external review, or go back through some of the proper channels in training. But I agree with Justice. You can't have that's it almost lends hand in hand, those two things. You can't have people who have never had those interactions, and you also can't have people that are policing themselves.
Yeah, you can't have people that have had only those interactions. Like, you need a cross section for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, Barry, Sarah, or Sam, you pick your poison.
Oh, yeah, let me jump in here for a second here. It's tough because I think our department is not facing the same issues that a lot of departments are facing. And so, but there's not a lot of transparency to really know what's going on. There's no real database that the public has access to see what's going on. I like the idea of external affairs, but having worked in industries where you are professionals, you hate to have somebody else come in and tell you how to do your job. And so that's always a fine line to be, a fine line to be treading as well, where you don't want to have some animosity between the board and the officers that you're supposed to be actually trying to assist, really. So I think trying to make sure that you're implementing training like it's really supposed to be happening. And I know, like, as an example, sometimes I've talked to some of the officers and previous chiefs in the past, and they'll say one thing, but then you talk to law enforcement officers on the boots on the ground, and they're saying, well, this isn't really happening. So it's hard to say what needs really change, because I don't know that everybody really has the full picture of what's really happening, because there is no real oversight at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I
It's
think
ambiguous, but that's I'm just trying to be forthright. I don't want to be making assumptions that there's rot in the midst of our police department, because I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think most of them are great officers, but there are the inherent systemic issues that is across every department in our country, because of the way that they were formed and the way that they have been systematized.
Yeah, I think you're correct. There's ideological, there's potential ideological pitfalls that are built in because of the system being the system.
Right.
And so we have to look at it both as a personnel thing and as a system thing. And it is so incredibly multifaceted. For that reason, there is no one answer. I think that's really insightful, Barry. Thank you for sharing that. Sam or Sarah, you guys are up.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me immediately is sensitivity training and things like that more on a schedule. And again, mental health is huge. And going off kind of what Barry said, we don't know what's going on. We hear often, OPD, there's nothing, there's no issues there, but we don't know. So it wouldn't hurt just to have those things in place on a schedule, just so that, they're ready for whatever.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as much as you need the regular training for, defensive tactics and de-escalation tactics, you need to have a regular, reoccurring, intentional, effective mental health portion. You have to.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, there are going to be, on the flip side, there's going to be there's going to be the chance for issues because people aren't in good mental health. And then there's also, on the flip side, going to be officers suffering because they're not, either receiving or seeking mental health care. So I think it's another case of both and, where you need to have those ideological trainings on a regular basis. Absolutely. Sam, did you have any other, or did you have?
I feel they've basically covered it in my eyes. It's just a lot of reevaluating what we're having our officers doing and taking calls for, and trying to find different sources that we can send out there in appropriate times just to take a load off them, while also taking care of our officers with getting mental health more just normalized in their industry, maybe not making them, but having them go even once a month to a counseling appointment. So then they get they get a system going with somebody. This person knows how they're normal and they know their tics when they start getting stressed out. So when they start going to their appointments, instead of just having them go when something traumatic happens, and then they're trying to hide it because of the toxicity in the work environment of they need to stay tough. If we have them with somebody who's like, hey, something's wrong with them, something's going on in their head, they're too stressed out, and it's not just there's a traumatic incident, I'm fine, then we can more so maybe even stop certain things from happening with these officers going over the deep end in moments, or even stopping them if we see, hey, they aren't fit for these scenarios, trying to redirect them to something else.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you do those sorts of regular trainings and regular check-ins, then there is a good chance that you can circumvent issues, because you can see someone who may be experiencing a sign of burnout or something sooner, because that's definitely something that happens, burnout within the job, and then you've got like a time period that you're trying to hit within the career so you can get your retirement, and maybe there's something that could circumvent an issue before it happens. So if I had to offer just my 2 cents on the idea, I think the one thing that I'm taking away from this conversation is whatever approach that we take locally, it is absolutely necessary that it is both departmental and systemic, and it is both mental health and tangible things. Like, it's so multifaceted, and we can't just get pigeonholed in one thing. It was really interesting to me because that was a thought that I didn't have in my head when I was coming to the conversation. In fact, most of the thoughts that were in my head didn't even come out because you guys brought up such great things. So I want to thank each and every one of you guys for being a part of this conversation. We've already been asked on the feed to do another video, and we're hoping to do some sort of video in a couple weeks here where we will bring back our officers from our first video and then bring back you guys and hopefully facilitate some sort of conversation on that topic. So keep your eyes peeled. There will likely and hopefully be a third installment of the Bridging the Thin Blue Line series. Thank you all so much for your time, everybody that was on this panel, and thank you everybody for watching. We appreciate you and we appreciate your presence and being part of the change that you wish to see in the world. While you might not realize it, engaging hard conversations is frequently the first step to creating change in our world. So thank you guys for engaging this conversations, both as speakers and as attendees. We appreciate your presence, and we hope to see you guys back here with Bridging the Thin Blue Line. Also, one quick plug before we go, we do have our final weekly protest tomorrow night at Lincoln Park. We will be protesting from 5 to 6, and we've decided to call our last protest the Liberty and Justice for All protests. We are hoping to gather people together to make a stand and just say, like, we're here and we are here for everybody so that there is equity and there is justice. We're taking the words from our very own pledge and we're putting them out there into the universe, and that's what we're standing for. It's a nonpartisan thing. It's not related to one issue. It is about all of us together making the world a better place. So much like this conversation, we're trying to take some tangible action there. So it'll be our final week of protesting tomorrow night at Lincoln Park, and we are going to start at 5 due to the change of times and it getting darker sooner, just for safety reasons. So thank you guys so much. Everybody have a great night. Keep an eye out for the third Bridging the Thin Blue Line series. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at Lincoln Park, and you guys, everybody have a great night.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See ya. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.